When a ruthless gang targeted an elderly black woman, they thought it was just another easy hit, another victim too afraid to fight back. What they didn't know was that with one phone call to her son, their fate was sealed. Her son wasn't just any man. He was a ghost from wars no one spoke about, trained to eliminate threats with ruthless precision. Now the enforcers, the corrupt officers protecting them, and the crime boss who thought he was untouchable would learn what happens when you push the wrong person too far. Before they could react, their empire would crumble, their safe houses would burn, and a city that had lived in fear for too long would finally rise. This isn't just about revenge. It's about one man's love for his mother that brought down an empire. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the city, stretching long shadows across cracked sidewalks and aging storefronts. The streets, once vibrant with neighbors greeting each other and children playing on porches, now carried an uneasy quiet beneath the weight of change. Regina Hawthorne stepped out of Harry Langston's barber shop, her coat draped over her arm, purse secured at her side. The smell of talcum powder and aftershave clung to her like a familiar embrace, a comforting contrast to the shifting city around her. Inside, men had gathered in their usual spots, some discussing sports, others shaking their heads at the latest headlines. Regina had never been just another customer there. She had taught half the men in that shop, had scolded them when they were boys, encouraged them when they were struggling, and reminded them what it meant to stand tall in a world that too often tried to push them down. Harry Langston, the shop's owner, wiped his hands on a striped towel, leaning against the counter with the casual authority of a man who had seen it all. His hair was nearly gone, his beard streaked with gray, but his voice still carried the same weight it had since they were kids. "You sure you don't want me to walk you home, Miss Hawthorne?" Harry asked, concern laced beneath his usual gruffness. Regina scoffed, shaking her head as she adjusted the strap of her purse. "Boy, I was walking these streets before you knew how to hold a straight razor. What makes you think I need an escort now?" The younger men in the shop chuckled, but Harry wasn't so easily dissuaded. "It ain't like it used to be, Regina. You know that." Regina gave him a look, sharp and unwavering. "Of course I do. But I won't start acting afraid just because the world expects me to. That's how you lose, Harry. You start cowering, and then they think they own you." Harry sighed, shaking his head. "Stubborn as ever." "Strong as ever," she corrected, smoothing a hand over her graying curls. "You let these young men hear you talk like that, next thing you know, they'll be the ones walking around like they don't own their own streets." She turned toward them now, casting a look that commanded attention. "The city don't belong to the ones tearing it apart. It belongs to the people willing to stand their ground." There were nods, murmurs of agreement, but Regina knew words only carried so far. Still, it mattered to say them. It mattered to remind them. She glanced back at Harry and softened just a little. "Besides, it's just a few blocks." Harry exhaled, rubbing a hand over his bald head. "You need anything, you call." "I mean it." Regina patted his arm before stepping toward the door. "You worry too much." Stepping outside, she let the evening warmth settle around her. The sun was still lingering, casting a honeyed glow over the tops of buildings, but the streetlights had already begun to flicker on, their hum filling the quiet spaces between distant sirens and murmured conversations. She walked with purpose, the way she always had. She had never let fear dictate her steps, had never been the kind of woman to shrink herself to fit the comfort of others. Her body had slowed over the years, but her will had not. She was a black woman, a teacher, A woman who had built herself brick by brick and refused to be torn down by the creeping tide of violence that had claimed so many corners of the city. And yet, even with all her certainty, she felt them before she saw them. The shift in the air. The low murmur of voices behind her. The kind of laughter that didn't carry warmth, but something colder, something edged. She didn't stop walking, didn't turn her head, but she listened. They weren't rushing. Not yet. They were watching, waiting. "Yo, look at this one," a voice muttered, young, cocky. "She's too old to be out here like this," another said, laughter in his tone. "Yeah," the first voice answered, louder now for her to hear. "Lady, you shouldn't be walking around alone." Regina kept moving. She had been in classrooms with boys like these before. Boys with too much to prove. Boys who hadn't yet learned that strength wasn't in how loud you spoke, but in how well you carried yourself. She had faced worse than this. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said without breaking stride, her voice even. One of them laughed. "Yeah, trouble's looking for you." She still didn't turn, but she felt them getting closer. She tightened her grip on her purse, her jaw locking as she weighed her options. She had no intention of running. No intention of showing them fear. Her house wasn't far. If she just kept walking, if she just ignored them, maybe they would let it be nothing more than empty intimidation. But deep down, she knew better. Regina Hawthorne kept her pace steady, refusing to let the tension crawling up her spine show in her stride. She had walked these streets too many times to start acting afraid now. But she wasn't foolish either. She could hear them getting closer, their footsteps light and unhurried, the kind of confidence that came from knowing they had the upper hand. She had taught boys like them before, seen that restless hunger in their eyes. The kind that came from wanting to prove something, to themselves, to their peers, to a world that had already written them off. Some of them had been saved, had let her voice cut through the noise before it was too late. Others had been swallowed whole, lost to the streets, to the gangs that promised power but delivered nothing but an early grave. Regina exhaled slowly, her grip tightening around the strap of her purse. The street ahead stretched out empty, lined with flickering streetlights and the occasional rustle of wind against storefront awnings. Home wasn't far. Just a few more blocks. One of the boys behind her whistled, sharp and mocking. "She acting like she don't hear us." A chuckle followed, low and taunting. "She hear us." Regina didn't stop, didn't acknowledge them. That was what they wanted, for her to engage, to give them something to feed off. A few more steps. Just keep walking. But then she felt it. The shift. The moment when playfulness turned to something sharper. When the space between them disappeared faster than she could react. A hand clamped down on her shoulder, fingers pressing just hard enough to let her know she wasn't going anywhere unless they allowed it. "Hold up, lady," the voice behind her said, all amusement gone now, replaced with something firmer. "We just want to talk." Regina stopped. Not out of fear, but because she knew when a fight was already decided before it even began. There were 3 of them, and she was an elderly woman alone on a street where no one was going to intervene. If she fought, she would lose. If she ran, she would fall before she ever got the chance. Slowly, she turned, keeping her expression neutral. The one holding her shoulder was young, early 20s at most, his hoodie half-zipped, a chain glinting against his collarbone. He had sharp features, the kind that hadn't yet been worn down by life, but carried the weight of someone who had already decided the world owed him something. His grip loosened slightly when she faced him fully, and she used the opportunity to pull herself free, stepping back just enough to reclaim her space, but not enough to provoke. "You've said what you wanted," she said, her voice as firm as it had ever been in a classroom filled with rowdy students. "Now let me be on my way." The young man on her left scoffed, shoving his hands into his pockets. His stance was loose, but the tension in his frame was unmistakable. "That's not how this works." The third one, younger than the rest, barely more than a boy, shifted his weight from foot to foot. His energy was more nervous than aggressive. "Ain't nobody trying to hurt you, lady," he muttered, though he kept his eyes on the ground as he spoke. "Just be smart about it." Regina met his gaze, something flickering behind her own. Recognition. She knew this one. "Tyrell," she said, and the boy's head snapped up like he had been struck. The leader stiffened. "Nah, lady, he goes by TK now." Regina kept her gaze on Tyrell. She knew that name. She knew that face, even if time and hardship had tried to change it. She had graded his papers, had scolded him for falling asleep in class, had once told him that he could be something if he wanted to. She saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the momentary crack in his armor. But it was gone just as fast as it had appeared. "I remember you," she continued, her voice unwavering. "And I remember your mother. She worked too damn hard for you to be out here doing this." The leader stepped in closer, a smirk curling on his lips. "That's sweet. She got a speech for you, TK. You gonna let an old woman school you in the middle of the street?" Tyrell's jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides, but he didn't move. The leader turned back to Regina, his amusement flickering into something colder. "Listen, lady, you can talk all you want, but talking don't change nothing. What changes things is money. What changes things is knowing who's in charge out here." He gestured vaguely around them, to the city that had let them become what they were. "And you? You're just another person walking around like this place still belongs to you. Like you're untouchable." Regina's spine straightened. Her gaze was unflinching. "You think because you've got the numbers, because you've got the power in this moment, that you own these streets? That people like me don't matter anymore?" She took a slow step forward, looking him straight in the eyes. "You don't know how wrong you are." There was a moment of stillness. The kind that stretched between two opposing forces, neither willing to move first. Then the leader clicked his tongue and chuckled, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe the audacity of the woman in front of him. He looked at his crew, then back at her, a new decision forming behind his eyes. "Well," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp, "let's see how much you matter when we take what's yours." Regina knew then, the robbery wasn't a question anymore. It was coming. But she didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She had made them look her in the eye. Had made one of them remember who he had been before the streets had claimed him. And if she couldn't stop what was about to happen, at least she could make damn sure they knew she wasn't just another victim. Regina Hawthorne had always believed in the power of standing tall. Of meeting adversity with the same unwavering resolve that had carried her through decades of teaching, through the struggles of raising a family, through the losses that life had thrown at her without warning. She had always understood that the world could be cruel. But she had never once allowed herself to be cowed by it. Even now, as she stood with her spine straight, her breath measured, and her heart steady in the face of the boys who thought they could take from her, she did not yield. But defiance alone had never been enough to stop the tide. She saw it in the eyes of the one who had spoken first, the one who carried himself with the kind of authority that only came from knowing he had never been challenged in a way that truly mattered. He was already bored of the exchange, already dismissing her words as nothing more than the empty noise of someone who didn't understand the world he lived in. He had come to a decision. And there was nothing left to do but follow through. She barely had time to react before his hand shot out again, this time gripping her purse with more force than before. She twisted away, clutching it tightly against her body, refusing to let it go without a fight. She wasn't naive enough to believe she could overpower him. But she also wasn't the kind of woman who let anything go without resistance. "Don't be stupid, lady," he muttered, his voice losing the last traces of amusement as he yanked harder, using his full strength. Regina braced herself, planting her feet, tightening her grip. But it was no use. The leather strap cut into her hand, burning against her skin as she struggled, her nails digging into it. But the boy was young, and she was not. And with one final, vicious tug, he tore it from her grasp. The force of it sent her staggering backward. She managed to stay upright for only a second before another set of hands shoved her hard from behind. The world lurched violently. The pavement rushed up to meet her before she could stop herself. Her knee scraped against the rough ground, pain bursting through her hip and shoulder as she hit the concrete, the impact rattling through her bones. Laughter echoed around her, cold and cruel. A sound that made her stomach turn more than the pain did. "She really thought she could fight back," one of them muttered, shaking his head. Regina pressed her palms against the ground, fingers stinging from the scrape, her breath coming sharp and unsteady. But she did not cry out. She did not beg. She tried to push herself up, but a sharp kick to her ribs sent her sprawling again, pain exploding in her side as the breath was forced from her lungs. Another kick landed, this time against her shoulder, jolting through her entire frame like a live wire, leaving a deep, aching throb in its wake. She could hear them still laughing, their words barely registering past the ringing in her ears, past the pulsing pain radiating through every nerve in her body. Then there was a pause. A shift in the air, followed by a low whistle of appreciation. "Check this out," the leader murmured, crouching beside her. She could see him now, just out of the corner of her eye. His fingers reached for her left hand. She knew before he even touched her what he was after. She closed her fingers, curling them tight into her palm, fighting to keep it from him. But he was stronger, prying them open with little effort, forcing her fingers apart with the kind of ease that made her stomach turn. "Nice ring," he said, turning it between his fingers as if it was nothing more than a trinket. "Bet this got some history." Regina swallowed, her throat burning, her breath still shallow from the blows. But she forced the words out anyway, her voice rasping but steady. "Please." It was not for herself. It was not for pride. It was for the memory of the man who had slipped that ring onto her finger so many years ago. The man who had loved her through every hardship. Who had stood beside her when the world felt too heavy. Who had left a part of himself with her in that simple band of gold. The leader didn't even look at her when he slipped it into his pocket. He stood, rolling his shoulders, as if none of it mattered. As if this was nothing more than another night. Another easy win. Regina remained where she was, lying against the pavement, feeling the weight of her body pressing into the unforgiving concrete. The pain would pass. The bruises would heal. The cuts would close. But none of that was what truly mattered. She would remember this moment. Not for the pain. Not for the humiliation. But for what it had set in motion. Somewhere in the distance, footsteps approached. A voice called her name, filled with concern, laced with worry. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see a familiar figure rushing toward her. James Parker. The man who had lived 2 doors down for over 20 years. The man who had no idea what was about to happen next. James Parker dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering, unsure whether to touch her, afraid of making things worse. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "What happened? Who did this to you?" She exhaled slowly, pressing her palms against the pavement, forcing herself up, despite the protest of every muscle in her body. "They took my purse," she said, her voice measured, her hand steady, despite the tremor in her ribs. "And my ring." James reached out, his grip firm but careful as he helped her to her feet, his expression darkening, his jaw tightening. "Come on, let's get you home." She nodded, allowing him to guide her, her steps slow, her body aching, but her mind sharper than it had ever been. They thought they had won tonight. They thought they had taken something from her. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. James Parker's grip was firm but careful as he helped Regina Hawthorne up the steps to her front door. She gritted her teeth through the pain radiating from her ribs and hip, refusing to let it show, refusing to let the night have that power over her. James had offered to take her to the hospital, had suggested calling the police, but she had dismissed both with a quiet, resolute shake of her head. She knew how that would go. The police would show up, take a statement, nod their heads, and drive off. They wouldn't patrol her neighborhood with urgency, wouldn't turn the city upside down to find the boys who had done this. Even if they caught them, she had no illusions about what would come next. Those boys would be back on the street in days, laughing about the old woman they had knocked down, showing off the ring they had stolen, moving on to the next easy target. But she was not an easy target. James exhaled, his voice thick with anger as he unlocked her door for her and guided her inside. "Miss Hawthorne, you need to let me do something. You shouldn't be alone right now." Regina, steadying herself against the back of her living room chair, inhaled slowly and forced a small, weary smile. "I've been alone before, James. This won't be the thing that breaks me." He stood there for a moment, his lips pressed into a hard line, the frustration clear in the way his fingers flexed at his sides. He was younger than her by a couple of decades but old enough to remember when this neighborhood had been different, when people didn't hesitate to sit on their porches late into the night, when mothers didn't worry about their children disappearing into the grip of gangs that had spread like a sickness. He had seen what had happened to the city, and he hated it as much as she did. "Call someone at least," he muttered. "You got family?" Regina's fingers tightened around the chair's wooden frame. "I do." She saw the flicker of relief cross his face, but he didn't know. He didn't understand what she meant. He thought she would call a daughter, a sister, maybe an old friend from church. James had no idea what was about to happen next. "Thank you for walking me home," she said, the finality in her voice unmistakable. He sighed, running a hand over his head before nodding. "You need anything, you call me." "I mean it." She watched him leave, his frustration still simmering in the air, and only when she heard the door click shut behind him did she allow herself to exhale, slow and deliberate. She was hurting. Her ribs ached, her palms stung, and her left hip throbbed from where it had collided with the pavement. But all of that faded into the background as she walked toward the small wooden table by her armchair, the one that held a framed photo of her late husband, David. She sat down carefully, reaching for the phone with fingers that had steadied despite the pain. She had never wanted to make this call. The number was still saved in her phone, though it had been years since she had last dialed it. She had never needed to. She had spent most of her life solving her own problems, fighting her own battles. She had raised her son to do the same. But this wasn't about pride. This was about what came next. The line rang twice before a voice answered, deep and measured, the same voice she had known since the day he was born. Ma. Regina inhaled slowly, letting the sound of his voice settle over her like a balm against the evening's wounds. He didn't sound rushed. He didn't sound worried. He sounded the way he always did, controlled, steady, waiting. Zion, she said, using the name she had given him, the name only she still called him, though the world had come to know him as something else. I need you to listen to me, baby. A pause, not long, just enough for him to recognize something in her tone, something she hadn't let him hear before. I'm listening. She closed her eyes, not to block out the pain but to keep her voice even as she spoke. I was coming home from Harry's shop. 3 of them followed me. Boys, too young to be doing what they're doing. They shoved me to the ground. Kicked me. Took my purse. She didn't say "and my ring" just yet, not because she wanted to spare him, but because she knew the weight those words would carry. There was silence on the other end. She could hear his breathing, slow and steady. The same way it had been when he was a boy, when he had learned to count each breath before a fight, before a test, before stepping onto a football field. He had always been that way, measured, in control. But she knew what was happening on the other side of that phone. She knew what was coiling inside him, pressing against the surface, waiting for an outlet. Did they hurt you? She exhaled through her nose. I'll heal. That's not what I asked. She didn't answer right away. Because yes, they had hurt her. But she knew that the way she answered would determine what happened next. She didn't want to lie to her son. She never had. But she also didn't want him to hear her say it out loud. Didn't want to give him the confirmation that she knew would send him hurtling down a path that couldn't be undone. So she settled for the truth, the only version of it she could give. I'll be fine. The silence stretched longer this time. And for the first time in years, she wished she could see his face. I'm coming home. His voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. It didn't waver. Zion, I'm coming home. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, letting the words settle deep in her chest, knowing there was no stopping him now. There was no pleading with him, no convincing him otherwise. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to. Her son had spent his life fighting for others, for a country that had sent him into battles he hadn't always believed in, for people who had never even known his name. And yet, the one thing he had never been able to fight for was this city, this family, this home. Now that fight had come for him. Stay home, Ma, he said, his voice still calm, still controlled. I'll be there soon. The line went dead. Regina placed the phone back onto the table, her fingers resting against the cool surface for a moment before she looked back at the photo of David. She sighed, shaking her head. Lord help them. She knew what was coming. And she knew those boys had no idea what they had just done. The plane touched down just after noon, the heat rising from the tarmac in waves as the engines hummed into stillness. Zion Hawthorne remained seated, his fingers interlaced, his posture relaxed. But beneath that stillness was something coiled, something that had been waiting for release from the moment he answered his mother's call. The airport was busy, people moving with purpose, conversations blending into a low hum of background noise. He barely heard any of it. His thoughts were ahead of him, already walking these streets, already scanning these faces, already hunting. Zion stepped outside and slid into the back seat of a waiting cab, giving the driver his mother's address. The man, older, with the weary eyes of someone who had seen the city change in ways he didn't like, hesitated before pulling away from the curb. "You visiting family?" the driver asked, his voice polite but carrying an edge of something else, something cautious. Zion didn't immediately answer. He watched the city slide past the window, his gaze sharp, dissecting every street corner, every group of young men huddled in conversation, every block that seemed quieter than it should have been. This was not the home he remembered. "Something like that," he finally said, his voice even. The driver nodded, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel as they idled at a red light. Across the intersection, a group of young men stood outside a convenience store, their movements slow but deliberate, their eyes darting toward the cab before turning away. They weren't loitering for the sake of it. They were watching, measuring, controlling. Zion had seen it before. Different country, same rules. Neighborhoods changed, the driver muttered under his breath. Zion barely glanced at him. "Yeah. So I've heard." The rest of the ride was silent, but the city spoke to him in ways words never could. The storefronts were tagged over with symbols that had meaning to the right people. The sidewalks lined with men who weren't standing there just to pass time. The fear was subtle, but it was there, woven into the way people moved, the way their eyes flickered away too quickly, the way conversations cut short when unfamiliar faces passed by. When they finally pulled up in front of his mother's house, the driver lingered for a second before speaking again. "You be careful out here. This ain't the same city you left." Zion met his gaze in the mirror, holding it for a beat before nodding. "Appreciate the ride." He stepped out, adjusting the strap of his duffel over his shoulder. The second his feet hit the pavement, he felt it, the weight of eyes on him. The old woman sitting on the porch across the street, clutching a newspaper, her lips pressed into a firm line as she watched him with recognition. The man walking his dog, his pace just a little too quick, his gaze flickering toward the house before shifting away. And then there were the others, a small cluster of men further down, their postures relaxed, but their conversation fading to a hush as they took him in. They weren't boys he recognized, but he knew their type. Zion didn't linger. He climbed the steps to his mother's porch, pushed the front door open, and stepped inside. The house smelled the same, spices, worn wood, the faint lingering scent of his mother's perfume. It was a house that had never changed, that had remained untouched by time, even as the world outside it shifted into something unrecognizable. Regina Hawthorne was in her chair, a cup of tea resting beside her, her posture composed, but her eyes carrying something heavier than before. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she set her cup down and rose to her feet. "Zion." She was the only person in the world who still called him that. He crossed the room, careful but purposeful, and wrapped his arms around her. He could feel the slight stiffness in her frame, the hesitation in the way she leaned into him, not from uncertainty, but from pain. His jaw tightened as he pulled back, his eyes scanning her face, taking in the faint bruises, the way she moved with just a little too much caution. "Tell me," he said, his voice steady but edged with something simmering just beneath. She sighed, shaking her head as if she had already made peace with the fact that he would not let this go. "You already know, baby. I want to hear it from you." She exhaled slowly, moving toward the kitchen, motioning for him to sit. "Eat first. Then we talk." He dropped his duffel onto the floor, taking the chair across from her as she placed a plate in front of him. The food was warm, familiar, but he barely tasted it. He ate because she expected him to, because it was the one thing she could offer him right now. When the silence stretched long enough, she set her tea down again and looked at him the way only a mother could, her gaze unwavering. They followed me. 3 of them. Young. I knew what they wanted before they took it. Zion's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, but he didn't speak. They shoved me. Kicked me when I was down. Her voice remained steady, but her hands, resting against the table, betrayed a slight tremor. Took my purse. Zion's breathing had not changed, but his entire body had gone still in the way that only came before action. She hesitated for just a moment before she added, "And my ring." His hands flexed once, just a small movement, but it was enough for her to know what was coming next. "Zion," she warned, but his expression remained unreadable. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet. Too quiet. "Do you know who they were?" She shook her head. "Does it matter?" His jaw clenched. "It matters." She studied him, sighing as she leaned back in her chair. "I need you to be careful." He met her gaze, unwavering. "I'll be careful." She didn't believe him. She never had when he said those words. She exhaled through her nose, her eyes scanning his face, before she gave a slow, resigned nod. "What are you going to do?" Zion reached for his napkin, wiping his fingers, his movements precise, measured. When he finally looked back up, there was no hesitation in his expression. "I'm going to find them," he said. "And I'm going to make sure they understand exactly who they touched." Regina's fingers curled against her cup. She had always known this day might come. Had always known that if the world ever forced her son's hand, he would not hesitate. She sighed, shaking her head as she murmured, "Lord help them." Because she knew what was coming next. And she knew those boys had no idea what they had just set in motion. Regina had always been a woman of resolve, a force of nature when she made up her mind about something. Zion Hawthorne had seen that strength in her all his life, in the way she had fought for her students, in the way she had held their family together through loss, in the way she had never once backed down from what was right. But tonight, as she sat across from him at the kitchen table, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her teacup, there was a different kind of determination in her gaze, one that he wasn't sure how to handle. He had expected fear, at least a trace of it. He had expected hesitation, maybe even a plea for him to let it go. But what he got instead was the same woman who had scolded him as a child for getting into fights, the same woman who had taught him to stand tall, but had never once let him believe that strength was measured only in fists. "You want to find them," Regina said, her voice even, her eyes locked onto his. "I do too." Zion leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. He had already decided what needed to be done, had already mapped out his next steps, had already set himself on the path that would take him to the boys who had dared to put their hands on his mother. What he hadn't accounted for was her wanting a say in it. "I don't need your help with this, Ma," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I just need to know if you recognize them. Anything that'll point me in the right direction." Regina exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening slightly around her cup. "I told you I didn't." She stopped, her lips pressing together as something shifted in her expression. A memory. A name. A face. She set her tea down carefully, her fingers steady, despite the bruises along her knuckles. "I do know them," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "And I know one thing." Zion waited, his patience unshaken. "They'll come again." Regina held his gaze unwavering. "And what if you don't? What if they find someone else first? Someone who doesn't have you to come running?" He didn't answer right away. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering but not losing an ounce of its weight. I may be old, but I'm not scared. Not when I have you. His chest tightened at that. She had never been one for dramatics, had never used words to manipulate, never wielded guilt like a weapon. But there was something about the quiet truth in her statement that struck deeper than any plea ever could. He sighed, running a hand over his beard before shaking his head. What exactly are you proposing? Regina leaned back, folding her arms in a way that told him she had already worked this out long before he had even set foot in this house. I borrow a necklace. A valuable one. I take the same route I did that night, and I wait. Zion's hand curled into a loose fist against the table. And when they come? A slow, knowing smile tugged at her lips. That's when you do what you do best. He exhaled sharply, not quite a laugh, not quite frustration, somewhere in between. He had walked into war zones with less hesitation than he was feeling now. It wasn't that he didn't believe in his mother's strength, he did, with every part of him. But he also knew the kind of men that had taken over this city. They won't come alone, he said finally. They'll be watching, waiting. Maybe even testing you to see if you're worth the risk. If they see anything out of place, anything that doesn't sit right, they'll scatter, and we'll be back to square one. Regina nodded, already ahead of him. Then we make sure nothing seems out of place. He sighed, rubbing his temples, knowing there was no winning this argument. And where exactly are you getting this necklace? A friend of mine. Evelyn has a daughter who married well, Regina said, a glint of amusement flickering through her eyes. A few years back, she bought herself something expensive and flashy for a gala, and she's hardly worn it since. When I told Evelyn what happened, she was more than happy to loan it to me. Zion raised an eyebrow. She knows what you're using it for? Regina took another sip of her tea. She knows I'm making sure no other woman in this neighborhood has to go through what I did. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, rolling the idea over in his mind. Every instinct in him told him this was a bad idea, that he should be the one walking those streets, that he should be the bait, that putting her in harm's way was something he could never allow. But he also knew his mother. She had made up her mind, and no amount of reasoning was going to change it. Finally, he nodded once, accepting what he couldn't control. Fine. But I'll be watching. The second something doesn't feel right, we shut it down. She gave him a look, one that said she had already assumed that much. Of course, baby. He shook his head, running a hand over his beard again, a habit she recognized as his way of steadying himself when things weren't sitting right. Tomorrow night, then. Just after sunset. We'll do it exactly the way it happened before. No variations. No changes. Regina smiled, slow and knowing. Then I suppose I should get some rest. I have a big day tomorrow. Zion stood, collecting their plates, shaking his head as he muttered, unbelievable. Regina chuckled softly, rising from her chair. That's what you get for having a mother who raised you to be fearless. He paused, looking at her, something unspoken passing between them. Then, finally, he let out a slow breath. Yeah, he murmured. I guess I do. The city breathed differently at night. The air, still thick with the warmth of the day, carried an edge of something sharper, an undercurrent of unspoken rules, of quiet threats lurking beneath the surface. Regina Hawthorne walked at her usual pace, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, her presence a deliberate challenge to the night itself. She could feel them before she heard them, the weight of their attention pressing against her back, a quiet calculation taking place just beyond the edges of her vision. They weren't rushing. They weren't careless. They moved with the patience of men who believed they had control of the situation before it had even begun. The leader was the first to speak, his voice low, confident, full of the kind of arrogance that came from never having faced a true consequence in his life. "Look at this," he murmured, more to his crew than to her. "She walking around like nothing happened." The second one, younger, meaner, let out a quiet scoff. "Old lady don't learn." Regina kept her stride even, her eyes forward, her breath steady. She had spent years in classrooms filled with boys just like them, had seen the same bravado, the same desperate need to be seen as more dangerous than they truly were. But there had always been a difference between play acting and what came after, the moment they crossed the wrong line. She could hear their steps falling in sync with hers now, feel the way they were closing the space between them inch by inch. They wanted her to feel it, to recognize that she was cornered, that there was nowhere left to go. The leader moved first, veering into her path, his head tilting slightly as if examining her. "That's a real nice necklace," he said, letting his gaze flicker down to the gold resting against her collarbone. "Looks expensive." Regina met his eyes without hesitation, her voice measured, unreadable. "It is." His smirk widened, his fingers flexing at his sides. "That's so? Might be safer if you let me hold on to it, just to make sure nothing happens to it." Regina exhaled, slow and steady. "You boys don't think past the moment, do you?" The leader blinked, something shifting in his expression for just a second before he forced the smirk back into place. "You think you're smarter than us, lady?" His voice had changed just slightly, the first crack in the mask of control. Regina tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "I think you made a mistake last time. And I think you're about to make a worse one." For the first time, he hesitated. Not much. Not enough for his crew to notice. But Regina noticed. Because deep down, he could feel it too, the change in the air, the invisible shift in balance. Something was wrong, and he didn't know what yet. But arrogance was a powerful thing, and he had no intention of backing down. "Hold her," he muttered to one of his men. "I'm taking that chain." The second one moved fast, his hand darting toward Regina's arm. But that was the moment everything unraveled. Because before his fingers could even graze the fabric of her sleeve, the shadows behind them came to life. Zion struck like a ghost emerging from the dark, his presence sudden and absolute, the air shifting with the sheer force of controlled violence. His first strike was a calculated dismantling, his grip locking onto the wrist of the man reaching for Regina and twisting it so violently that the sharp, sickening crack of bone echoed against the alley walls. A strangled cry burst from the gang member's throat as his knees buckled beneath him, his other hand instinctively reaching for the damaged limb. Zion didn't give him the chance to recover. He pivoted smoothly, driving an elbow into the man's ribs with the kind of precision that shattered air from lungs and left no room for resistance. The gang member collapsed, coughing, gasping, his hand cradling his ruined wrist. Everything shifted in an instant. The second one lunged, moving on instinct rather than thought, his arm swinging in a wide arc. Zion didn't flinch. He sidestepped effortlessly, letting the punch slice through empty space, before delivering a brutal knee to the man's gut. The impact sent the attacker stumbling back, his entire body curling inward from the force, his breath coming in sharp, pained wheezes. Regina stood exactly where she had been, untouched, unmoved, watching her son dismantle them piece by piece with the same efficiency she had always known was inside him. The leader took a single stumbling step backward, his bravado slipping like water through his fingers. He had seen street fights before, had thrown his fair share of punches, had been on both the winning and losing ends of a brawl. But this was different. Zion didn't fight like someone from these streets. He fought like someone who had seen the inside of war, like someone who had walked through places where men died without a sound, where violence wasn't about dominance but survival. The leader realized it too late. "Who the hell," he started, but Zion was already moving. A single, brutal step closed the distance between them, and before the gang leader could react, Zion's hand shot out, gripping the front of his hoodie and yanking him forward with terrifying ease. The gang leader barely had time to suck in a breath before his back collided with the nearest brick wall, the impact forcing a strangled sound from his throat. Zion didn't let go. He kept him pinned, his grip ironclad, his breathing calm. "You touched my mother," Zion said, his voice quiet, so quiet it was more terrifying than a scream. The gang leader twitched, his hands grappling at Zion's wrist, trying to pry himself free. I didn't." "Shut up," Zion said simply. His grip tightened, his knuckles going white against the fabric. The leader's breath stuttered, his pulse thundering against his throat as the reality of the situation began to set in. He wasn't in control. He had never been in control. Regina, still standing where she had started, didn't move. She didn't need to. She had told them they had made a mistake. Now they were starting to understand just how big of one it had been. Zion leaned in slightly, his voice even lower now, almost gentle. "Tell me where the rest of you are." The leader swallowed hard, shaking his head. Zion slammed him against the wall again, the force knocking the breath from his lungs. "You think I'm asking?" The leader coughed, gasping, but he was already breaking. He wasn't built for this. He was a predator in a small pond, never expecting a bigger one to come crashing in. "Tyrell," he gasped, his voice cracking. "Tyrell knows." Zion barely reacted. His eyes flickered toward the boy he had already marked the moment he had stepped onto this street. Tyrell stood frozen, caught between loyalty and self-preservation, his hands clenched at his sides. "Where?" Zion pressed. Tyrell hesitated, his gaze darting between the gang leader and Zion. His jaw tensed. Then, finally, he exhaled and muttered, "Warehouse on 5th. Near the train yard." Zion held his stare for a second longer, reading him, measuring the truth in his words. Then, finally, he let go. The gang leader slumped to the ground, his hands trembling as he coughed and wheezed, barely able to keep himself upright. Zion didn't spare him another glance. Instead, he turned, his movements fluid, controlled, as if none of this had touched him in the slightest. Regina watched him, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to do this," she said, though they both knew it wasn't true. Zion adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, his face unreadable. "I do." She sighed, shaking her head. "Then go." He nodded once, before stepping away. Tyrell stood frozen for a second longer, then turned and followed. The night wasn't over yet. The warehouse loomed ahead, its skeletal frame bathed in the glow of distant streetlights. Zion approached with measured steps, his presence a whisper against the night, his breath controlled. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil, rust, and something older, something soaked into the walls from years of men like Novak using places like this to build their empires. Zion stepped through the doorway, his boots making no sound against the concrete floor. He wasn't here for a prolonged fight. He was here to end this. A slow clap echoed from the catwalk above. You really don't know when to quit, a voice drawled. Lena Vasquez leaned against the railing, her posture deceptively relaxed. Below her, Novak's remaining men shifted uneasily, their fingers twitching toward their weapons. They had seen what Zion had done to their brothers. They knew what he was capable of. Zion didn't look at them. His gaze remained locked on Lena. Where is he? She smirked. You're late. Novak's already gone. Zion exhaled through his nose. I didn't ask where he was. I asked where he is. Lena's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Then she straightened, rolling her shoulders. You think you can just walk in here, Anne? Zion moved. He was on the first man before he could draw his weapon, his fist driving into the side of his jaw with the precision of a hammer striking steel. The man crumpled instantly. Zion twisted, disarming the second before he could react, breaking his wrist with a single calculated motion. A gun fired, too slow. Zion sidestepped, closing the distance to the third man in a blur, his elbow connecting with his throat. The fourth hesitated, his grip on his weapon uncertain. Zion didn't give him a chance to reconsider. He grabbed the barrel, forcing it upward, before delivering a ruthless strike to the bridge of the man's nose. Blood sprayed across the floor. Lena didn't move. By the time the last body hit the ground, Zion turned back to her, unshaken, his breathing steady. You're fast, Lena murmured. You're stalling, Zion replied. She sighed, tipping her head slightly. I should kill you. You should try. A slow smirk curved her lips. All right then. She leapt from the catwalk. Zion barely had time to adjust his stance before she was on him, a flurry of movement, her strikes precise, brutal. She wasn't like the others. She was trained, methodical, every attack calculated to break him down. Zion met her force with equal measure, his blocks seamless, his counters devastating. The fight was raw, quick, the air thick with the sound of fists meeting flesh, the crack of bones absorbing impact. Then, suddenly, she hesitated. Zion saw it, the flicker of something in her eyes, something uncertain. And in that moment, he ended it. His fist drove into her ribs with bone-crushing force. She gasped, stumbling, and Zion seized the opportunity. He caught her wrist, twisted it behind her back, and forced her down against the nearest crate. She coughed, blood dripping from her lip, but she still smirked. You're better than I thought. Zion leaned in, his grip unrelenting. Where is Novak? She exhaled shakily. You really don't stop, do you? No. Lena's smirk finally faded. She shifted slightly, her body going still. Then, so quietly that even Zion almost missed it, she said, North Tower. Top floor. Zion released her. She remained on the ground, her breathing heavy, but she didn't try to fight anymore. Go, she murmured. Before you're too late. Zion didn't waste another second. The city blurred past as he drove, the weight of finality pressing against his ribs. This was it. This was the end. The skyscraper loomed, its windows glinting under the city's glow. Zion parked the car, his fingers flexing against the wheel for just a moment before he stepped out. The guards at the entrance barely had time to register his presence before he took them down, quick, efficient, silent. He moved through the lobby like a shadow, slipping past security with the ease of someone who had done this before, who had walked through buildings just like this in different countries, under different wars. The elevator ride was slow. agonizingly slow. Zion closed his eyes, steadying his breath. When the doors opened, he didn't hesitate. Novak was waiting. The office was lavish, untouched by the violence outside its walls. Novak stood near the window, his reflection staring back at him through the glass. "You know," he said, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand, "I knew you'd come. I just didn't think you'd make it this far." Zion stepped forward. "You're out of men." Novak chuckled. "There are always more men." "Not for you." Novak finally turned, his smile thin. "So this is it, then?" Zion didn't answer. Novak sighed, setting his glass down. "You think killing me changes anything?" Zion tilted his head. "I think it changes enough." Novak's fingers twitched. His eyes flickered toward the desk. A gun. Zion saw it before he moved. The shot rang out, shattering the air. Novak staggered, clutching his chest, his breath hitching. He looked down, eyes wide, disbelieving, before his knees buckled. He collapsed. Zion watched, unmoving, as the life drained from him. The city below remained unchanged, oblivious to the war that had just ended. Zion inhaled slowly. It was over. Finally, it was over. The sirens were distant at first. Then closer. Zion turned, stepping away, his movements unhurried. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. Zion stood outside the precinct, the weight of the night settling over him, the city breathing differently now that Novak was gone. The world had shifted in the span of hours, but there was no satisfaction in it, no relief. His mother was safe. That was the only thing that mattered. But there was still work to be done. Detective Mercer approached, his cigarette burning low between his fingers. He exhaled, watching Zion in the dim light of the street lamp. "You're still here," he muttered. Zion didn't look at him. "Never said I was leaving." Mercer scoffed, shaking his head. "Could have fooled me. Figured you'd be halfway across the country by now." Zion smirked slightly, the closest thing to humor he had allowed himself since stepping off that plane. "Not my style." Mercer studied him, the silence stretching between them. The city was shifting beneath their feet, the power vacuum left behind in Novak's wake already starting to pull at the seams of the underworld. "So what now?" Mercer finally asked. Zion straightened, his gaze locked on the horizon, on the streets he had once walked as a boy, the streets that had tried to take everything from his mother. "There's still work to do," he said simply. Mercer let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it, just understanding. "Yeah," he muttered, running a hand over his jaw before sighing. "There is." Regina Hawthorne had always believed that change didn't come from waiting. It came from standing, from refusing to bow to fear. She had stood tall when the world tried to push her down, and she had raised a son who would do the same. Now, as the city braced for what came next, she knew one thing for certain. They had no idea what was coming for them.